A judge sentences an innocent black man to the death penalty, convinced he's just another criminal. But what he doesn't know? This man isn't just any prisoner. He's a lethal Navy SEAL, trained in survival, strategy, and combat. As the clock ticks down to his execution, secrets unravel, exposing a corrupt system designed to bury the truth. Who set him up? And what happens when the judge finally learns the terrifying truth about the man he condemned? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The rain fell in heavy sheets outside the courthouse, drumming against the stone steps where dozens of protesters huddled under umbrellas. Their signs, some handmade with running ink, others professionally printed, all carried the same message: justice for Isaiah. The crowd's chants echoed off the building's imposing facade, but their voices were quickly drowned out by the aggressive shouting of reporters and the mechanical whir of news cameras. Through the glass doors, Judge Samuel Beckett watched the scene with cold disdain. His perfectly pressed black robe swished as he turned away from the window, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The corner of his mouth twitched upward in a subtle sneer as he passed the protesters without a second glance. "Clear the way," a bailiff called out as Beckett approached the courtroom. The crowd of reporters parted like water, their cameras still flashing. Inside courtroom 3A, Isaiah Cole sat straight-backed in his orange jumpsuit, his hands bound by cold steel cuffs that bit into his wrists. Despite the chains, he carried himself with the same discipline that had earned him distinction in the Navy SEALs. His dark eyes scanned the jury box, taking in the 12 faces that would decide his fate. 11 white, 1 Asian. Their expressions ranged from careful neutrality to barely concealed suspicion. At the prosecution table, District Attorney Wilson shuffled his papers with an air of smug satisfaction. He kept glancing at Isaiah like a cat eyeing a cornered mouse. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Beckett entered. The room rustled with movement, but Isaiah noticed how Beckett's eyes narrowed when they landed on him, that flash of contempt impossible to miss. "Be seated," Beckett commanded, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. "Mr. Wilson, you may present your evidence." The prosecutor stood, straightening his expensive tie. "Your Honor, we'll begin with security footage from the night in question." The lights dimmed as a grainy video played on the courtroom screen. It showed a figure in dark clothing entering a building, then jumped forward 20 minutes. As you can see, there's a clear gap in the timestamp. From the defense table, Naomi Ellis shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor, this footage has clearly been tampered with. The 20-minute gap?" "Overruled," Beckett cut her off without even looking her way. "Continue, Mr. Wilson." Wilson's smile widened as he presented a knife in an evidence bag. "This weapon was found near the scene. While there are no clear fingerprints, our experts will testify that the partial prints are consistent with the defendant's hand size and pattern." "Objection!" Naomi's voice rang out again, fierce and determined. "This is speculation, not evidence. No actual fingerprint match exists." "Overruled," Beckett snapped, this time fixing her with an icy stare. "Ms. Ellis, control yourself or I'll hold you in contempt." The prosecution's parade of witnesses began. First came a nervous-looking man who couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes, as he claimed to have seen Isaiah near the crime scene. Then a woman who stumbled over her rehearsed testimony about hearing threats. With each witness, Naomi's cross-examination revealed inconsistencies, but Beckett sustained every prosecution objection, blocking her most crucial questions. When Naomi presented Isaiah's military records showing his deployment overseas during the time of the crime, Beckett's mask of impartiality cracked completely. "Your Honor," Naomi argued, holding up the authenticated documents, "these records prove it was physically impossible for Mr. Cole to have committed this crime. He was serving his country, leading counterterrorism operations." "Serving his country?" Beckett's voice dripped with contempt. "The defendant is a disgrace to the uniform. His kind—" He caught himself, but the damage was done. The racial undertone hung heavy in the air. Isaiah's jaw tightened, but he remained still, his training helping him maintain control even as rage burned in his chest. His mother, sitting in the first row behind him, pressed her hands together as if in prayer. The jury filed out for deliberations as storm clouds continued to darken the sky outside. They returned just 45 minutes later, not even enough time to properly review the evidence. Isaiah's heart pounded, but his face remained impassive as the foreman stood. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. The word fell like a hammer blow. Behind Isaiah, his mother let out a wail of anguish that cut through the courtroom's formal silence. She collapsed forward, supported by Isaiah's aunt as she sobbed, "No, no, my baby boy." Beckett's face showed no emotion as he watched her pain. If anything, there was a slight upturn to his lips as he prepared to deliver the sentence. He stared down at Isaiah, clearly savoring the moment. "Isaiah Cole, you represent everything wrong with our society. The world will be better off without you. I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Camera shutters clicked rapidly as officers moved to lead Isaiah away. He stood slowly, his chains rattling. The rage inside him was a living thing now, but he refused to give Beckett the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, he lifted his chin and met the judge's gaze directly. His eyes blazed with defiance, carrying a clear message. This isn't over. The rain had stopped by the time they let him out, but the sky remained dark and threatening. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and protesters called out words of support. But Isaiah heard them all as if from a great distance. His focus was internal now, his mind already shifting from the shock of injustice to the steel-hard determination that had kept him alive in war zones. They might have the power to lock his body in a cell, but they couldn't chain his spirit. As the prison transport van's doors closed behind him, Isaiah's expression remained unchanged, controlled, focused, and undefeated. The prison transport van rumbled down the rain-slicked highway, its wipers fighting against the steady downpour. Inside, Isaiah sat perfectly still, his wrists and ankles bound by heavy chains that connected to a metal loop welded to the floor. The rhythmic tapping of raindrops against the van's metal roof created an almost hypnotic backdrop to the tense silence. Across from him, Deputy Warden Clyde Mercer sprawled on the bench with the casual arrogance of a man who enjoyed having power over others. His bulk filled the space, muscled arms covered in faded tattoos stretching the fabric of his uniform. A silver badge gleamed on his chest, catching the dim light filtering through the van's small windows. Mercer's jaw worked steadily as he chewed his gum, making loud smacking sounds that echoed in the confined space. His eyes never left Isaiah, studying him like a predator sizing up potential prey. The other prisoners, 3 men sharing the long bench against the wall, kept their heads down, their body language screaming submission and fear. "Welcome to Redwood, boy." Mercer's voice dripped with false friendliness as he blew a bubble and let it pop loudly. "You're gonna love it there." His smirk widened, revealing teeth stained yellow from tobacco. The other prisoners seemed to shrink further into themselves at the mention of Redwood. One man, his face lined with old scars, briefly met Isaiah's eyes before quickly looking away. The message was clear. Redwood Penitentiary wasn't just any prison, it was somewhere even hardened criminals feared. Isaiah remained silent, his face a mask of careful neutrality. His training had taught him to observe, to gather information, to wait for the right moment. So he watched Mercer, noting how the deputy warden's friendly facade occasionally slipped to reveal glimpses of the cruelty beneath. The van wound through increasingly remote countryside until the trees gave way to a clearing dominated by towering concrete walls. Redwood Penitentiary rose from the misty rain like something from a nightmare. A massive gray fortress that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the stormy day. Searchlights cut through the gloom, illuminating rings of razor wire that crowned the walls. The sharp metal coils glistened wetly, like the teeth of some enormous beast. Guard towers loomed at regular intervals, their windows dark and watchful. The van passed through 3 separate checkpoints before pulling up to the intake area. The engine died, leaving only the sound of rain and the distant crack of thunder. Mercer stood, ducking his head under the low ceiling. "End of the line, boys. Welcome to your new home." The guards outside yanked open the van's doors, letting in a blast of cold air. They grabbed the first prisoner roughly, dragging him out into the rain. The second and third followed, leaving Isaiah for last. As he carefully maneuvered his shackled body toward the door, a guard's hand shot out, gripping his shoulder. With practiced coordination, they slammed Isaiah's head against the van's metal frame. "Oops," one guard sneered, exchanging knowing looks with his partner. "Watch your step there, inmate." Isaiah didn't give them the satisfaction of a response. He straightened up slowly, rain running down his face, and fixed them with a steady glare that made them shift uncomfortably. These weren't hardened fighters. They were bullies used to dealing with broken men. Mercer appeared beside them, still working his gum. "Get him processed. I'll handle the orientation myself." The intake procedure was designed to strip away dignity, invasive searches, delousing showers, ill-fitting orange uniforms. Throughout it all, Isaiah maintained his composure, his mind already mapping the facility's layout, noting guard rotations, observing which officers seemed to be in Mercer's pocket. "Pay attention now," Mercer said as he led Isaiah through gray corridors that echoed with distant shouts and the metallic clash of cell doors. "Redwood's got its own special way of doing things. You military types usually have trouble adjusting." They passed through a series of security gates, each one closing with a heavy finality behind them. Through barred windows, Isaiah caught glimpses of the prison yard, a concrete expanse where clusters of inmates huddled against the rain. "See those boys there?" Mercer nodded toward a group of heavily muscled white inmates covered in Nazi tattoos. "That's the Aryan Brotherhood. They run most of the yard. Good friends of mine, you might say." His smile showed too many teeth. "They help keep order and we look the other way sometimes." They passed another group, black inmates who watched them with hard, suspicious eyes. Nearby, Latino prisoners turned their backs demonstratively. "Don't expect any friends here?" Mercer continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Your brothers don't trust military men. Too many of them ended up being cops. And the whites?" He chuckled. "Well, you can figure that out yourself." The tour ended at a cell block that seemed older than the rest of the prison. The air here was thick with mold and despair. Mercer led Isaiah to a cell at the far end, a narrow concrete box with a steel toilet, a thin mattress, and walls covered in desperate scratches. Home sweet home. Mercer gave Isaiah a hard shove, sending him stumbling into the cell. The door slammed shut with a boom that echoed through the block. Mercer's face appeared in the small window, his earlier fake friendliness replaced by naked malice. "Let's see how long a SEAL lasts in here." His whisper carried clearly through the bars. A buzzer sounded somewhere in the distance and the cell block's lights clicked off one by one. Darkness crept in like a living thing, broken only by faint emergency lights that cast more shadows than illumination. Somewhere in the prison a man screamed, another answered with laughter. Isaiah stood motionless in the center of his cell, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The sounds of violence echoed through the old walls, fists meeting flesh, guards shouting commands, the unmistakable sound of someone being dragged across concrete. 3 days passed like a slow-moving fog through Redwood's concrete halls. Isaiah maintained complete silence, his presence like a ghost among the prison population. During meals, he sat alone at the far end of the cafeteria, his back to the wall, dark eyes constantly scanning the room. He memorized every detail, which guards worked, which shifts, which inmates controlled which tables, and most importantly, who answered to whom. The guards made a show of contaminating his food, spitting into his tray while making direct eye contact, daring him to react. Isaiah would simply hold their gaze, his face an unreadable mask, and eat methodically. Each bite was mechanical, divorced from taste or dignity. It wasn't about the food, it was about showing them they couldn't break him. During yard time, he walked the perimeter alone, his stride measured and purposeful. His military training showed in his posture, shoulders squared, head on a constant swivel, always maintaining awareness of his surroundings. Other inmates gave him a wide berth, but their eyes followed him constantly. The Aryan Brotherhood members, in particular, watched him with predatory interest, whispering among themselves and making crude gestures. Isaiah noticed the subtle shifts in routine. The guard in Tower 3 would turn away at precisely 2:45 p.m., creating a blind spot near the weight pile. The night shift officer in Block C always disappeared for exactly 17 minutes, probably to meet with whoever was smuggling contraband. Every detail, every pattern was filed away in his mind, building a mental map of Redwood's true power structure. But there was something else building too, a tension in the air like the pressure before a storm. Isaiah recognized it from his combat days, that electric feeling when an ambush was imminent. He saw it in the way certain inmates would suddenly find reasons to be elsewhere, in the knowing smirks of the corrupt guards, in the way conversations would stop when he passed by. On the fourth morning, Isaiah entered the shower block during his assigned time slot. The facilities were decrepit. Cracked tiles, rusted pipes, and poor lighting created deep shadows between the shower heads. Steam filled the air, reducing visibility and muffling sounds. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and Isaiah knew it was coming. 3 white inmates emerged from the steam like phantoms. They were big men, their pale skin covered in prison tattoos that marked them as high-ranking members of the Brotherhood. Each held a makeshift shank. Toothbrushes and combs melted down and sharpened against concrete until they were deadly weapons. The first attacker lunged forward, aiming for Isaiah's throat with practiced precision. But Isaiah was already moving, his body responding with trained reflexes honed through years of combat. He stepped inside the man's reach, grabbing his weapon arm and twisting sharply. The sound of breaking bone cut through the steam, followed by a howl of pain as the shank clattered to the wet floor. The second man came in low, trying to gut Isaiah while he was engaged. The shank found its mark, slicing into Isaiah's side, but he didn't let the pain show on his face. Instead, he drove his elbow down into his attacker's temple, sending him sprawling across the slippery tiles. The third assailant was more cautious, circling with his weapon held in a fighter's grip. Blood ran down Isaiah's side, but his eyes never left his opponent. When the man finally committed to his attack, Isaiah was ready. He caught the stabbing hand, turned his hip, and used his attacker's momentum to slam him face first into the concrete wall. The impact was devastating. Teeth and blood sprayed across the tiles. In less than 30 seconds, it was over. 3 of the Brotherhood soldiers lay broken on the shower floor, their weapons scattered around them. One clutched his shattered wrist, another was unconscious, and the third spat blood and fragments of teeth into a growing red puddle. The sound of boots on wet tile announced the arrival of the guards. They took in the scene with amused expressions, making no move to help either Isaiah or his would-be killers. One of them, a heavy-set officer with a face like carved stone, lit a cigarette despite prison regulations. "You made the wrong enemies, boy," he drawled, blowing smoke into the steam-filled air. "Guess you'll have to learn the hard way." They grabbed Isaiah roughly, ignoring his bleeding wound, and dragged him through the prison's corridors. Inmates pressed against their cell bars to watch, some with satisfaction, others with newfound respect. The guards didn't bother taking him to the infirmary. Instead, they headed straight for the solitary confinement block. The solitary cell was even smaller than his regular one, with no window and only a thin shaft of light coming through the door slot. They threw him inside without ceremony, his wounded body hitting the concrete floor hard. The door slammed shut with a sound of finality, leaving Isaiah alone in near-total darkness. Blood continued to seep from the wound in his side, but Isaiah's mind was already elsewhere. He remembered the endless training sessions with his SEAL team, the instructors pushing them beyond normal human limits. Pain is temporary, they would say. Weakness is a choice. Despite the stabbing pain in his side, Isaiah pressed his palms against the cold concrete floor. He started doing push-ups, his movements controlled and deliberate. Each rep sent fresh waves of agony through his body, but he embraced it, used it to fuel his determination. The blood made his hands slip on the floor, so he adjusted his position and kept going. In the darkness, his voice barely a whisper, Isaiah spoke the first words he'd uttered since arriving at Redwood. "They want me broken. I'll make them regret it." His words were swallowed by the thick walls, but their meaning hung in the air like a promise. The push-ups continued, each one a declaration of defiance, each drop of blood on the concrete a signature on that promise. In the pitch-black solitary cell, while his wound went untreated and infection began to set in, Isaiah Cole refused to give his enemies what they wanted most: his submission. After 7 days in the darkness of solitary confinement, the heavy metal door finally creaked open. Isaiah squinted against the harsh fluorescent lights as 2 guards roughly pulled him to his feet. His side throbbed where the shank had pierced him, the wound barely starting to heal without proper medical attention. But Isaiah kept his face neutral, refusing to show any sign of discomfort as they marched him back to general population. The yard was exactly as he'd left it, a concrete wasteland surrounded by towering walls and razor wire. But something had changed. As Isaiah walked through the exercise area, he noticed the shift in how other inmates watched him. The Black and Latino prisoners who had previously kept their distance now followed his movements with careful consideration rather than suspicion. Isaiah found an empty spot against the fence and began his usual routine of bodyweight exercises, ignoring the burning pain in his side. He was halfway through a set of push-ups when a shadow fell across him. Looking up, he saw a muscular black man with scarred knuckles standing over him. The man's stance spoke of fighting experience, probably a boxer based on how he carried himself. "Name's Jamal," the man said, squatting down to Isaiah's level. His voice was quiet, meant only for their ears. "Word is you took down 3 of those Nazi boys in the shower. That true?" Isaiah continued his push-ups, not breaking rhythm as he answered with a simple nod. "You military? That why you don't break?" Jamal pressed, studying Isaiah's form with professional interest. Isaiah completed his set before sitting back on his heels, meeting Jamal's gaze directly. "I don't break for no one," he said, his voice rough from disuse but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Jamal nodded slowly, a hint of respect crossing his features. "Maybe we should talk," he said, offering Isaiah a hand up. Throughout the day, whispers spread through the prison like wildfire. The story of how Isaiah had survived the Brotherhood's ambush grew with each telling. Some said he'd killed all 3 attackers with his bare hands. Others claimed he'd taken their shanks and eaten them raw to show dominance. The truth was somewhere in between, but the impact was the same. Isaiah Cole had become someone to watch. The minority inmates who had long suffered under the Brotherhood's reign of terror began gathering in small groups to discuss this development. They saw something in Isaiah they hadn't seen in years: hope. Here was someone who had stood up to the white supremacists and lived to tell about it. In his office overlooking the yard, Deputy Warden Mercer watched these gatherings with growing fury. His pale face turned red as he observed Isaiah talking quietly with Jamal and a few other inmates. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The seal should have been broken by now, begging for protection like all the others. Mercer grabbed his radio and barked orders to Officer Stevens, one of his most brutal guards. "Handle that situation," he commanded, pointing through the window at Isaiah. "Show him what happens to inmates who don't know their place." Stevens approached Isaiah with his hand resting on his baton, a sadistic smile playing across his face. "On your feet, inmate," he barked. "Random search time." Isaiah rose slowly, his movements careful and measured. Other inmates backed away, forming a loose circle around them. They'd seen these random searches before. They usually ended with someone in the infirmary. Stevens swung his baton without warning, aiming for Isaiah's injured side. But Isaiah was ready. He stepped inside the guard's reach, using Stevens' own momentum against him. In one fluid motion, he redirected the baton's path, causing Stevens to stumble forward off balance. The guard recovered quickly, throwing a wild punch that Isaiah easily avoided. Years of close-quarters combat training took over as Isaiah maneuvered Stevens into an awkward position, making it impossible for the guard to use his weapons or radio for backup without obviously assaulting an inmate who wasn't fighting back. "You can either walk away," Isaiah said quietly so only Stevens could hear, "or we can see how this ends. Your choice." Stevens' face contorted with rage and humiliation, but he knew he was outmatched. With a string of curses, he backed away, trying to maintain some semblance of authority. "This isn't over," he spat. The yard had gone completely silent during the confrontation. Now, as Stevens retreated, the inmates looked at Isaiah with a new kind of awe. He hadn't just survived, he had won without throwing a single punch. Over the next few days, Isaiah noticed inmates starting to mirror his exercise routine. During yard time, small groups would gather nearby, watching his movements and trying to copy his techniques. Instead of ignoring them, he began offering quiet corrections and demonstrations. "Control your breathing," he would say, showing them proper form for push-ups. "Your mind controls your body. Your body doesn't control you." The lessons went beyond simple exercise. Isaiah taught them discipline, focus, and most importantly, how to defend themselves without escalating violence. He showed them pressure points, escape techniques, and ways to deflect attacks without causing serious harm. From their corner of the yard, the Aryan Brotherhood watched these training sessions with increasing anger. Their power had always depended on fear and the threat of violence. Now, for the first time, their potential victims were learning to fight back. In his office, Mercer paced back and forth like a caged animal. Finally, he snatched up his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. After 3 rings, Judge Beckett's cold voice answered. "What is it, Mercer?" "I'm busy." "We have a problem," Mercer said, his voice tight with frustration. "The seal isn't breaking. He's actually getting stronger, and he's teaching others." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Beckett spoke again, his voice dripped with contempt. "Then kill him before he gets too strong." Judge Samuel Beckett sat in his mahogany-lined office, the evening sun casting long shadows across his expensive desk. In his right hand, he held a crystal tumbler filled with aged whiskey. In his left, a crumpled report from Redwood Penitentiary. His face grew darker with each paragraph he read. The report, written in Deputy Warden Mercer's precise handwriting, detailed troubling developments within the prison walls. Isaiah Cole, the former Navy SEAL who should have been broken by now, was instead becoming a rallying point for the minority inmates. The report described how Cole had established an informal training program during yard time, teaching other prisoners not just physical defense techniques, but mental resilience as well. "Subject has been observed instructing inmates in military-style hand-to-hand combat," Beckett read aloud, his voice thick with contempt. "Groups of 8 to 12 inmates regularly gather to learn these techniques. More concerning is Cole's emphasis on discipline and unity among the minority population." Beckett's hand tightened around the glass until his knuckles turned white. The thought of Black and Latino inmates learning to defend themselves, to resist intimidation, to organize, it made his stomach turn. This wasn't how his system was supposed to work. The natural order, as he saw it, was being disrupted. He flipped to the next page where Mercer had noted another disturbing trend. White supremacist groups losing influence as more inmates align with Cole's teachings. Traditional power structure showing signs of destabilization. Destabilization, Beckett spat the word like poison. He drained his whiskey in one burning gulp and slammed the crystal tumbler down on his desk. This couldn't be allowed to continue. Isaiah Cole was becoming exactly what Beckett had feared. A leader, an inspiration, a symbol of resistance against the very system Beckett had spent his career maintaining. With trembling fingers, he picked up his phone and dialed Mercer's number. The deputy warden answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting for this call. "Mercer?" Beckett's voice was cold and precise. "I want him gone." "Sir?" Mercer's voice crackled through the speaker. "Cole, I want him eliminated." Beckett paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Make it look like an accident." There was a moment of silence on the line before Mercer responded, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Yes, sir. I understand completely." Back in Redwood Penitentiary, Isaiah Cole lay on his narrow bunk, his breathing steady and controlled even in sleep. Years of military training had taught him to rest lightly, always ready to snap to alertness at the first sign of threat. That alertness served him well when a loud bang echoed through his cell at 3 a.m. The sound of a baton striking metal bars jolted him awake instantly. Isaiah's eyes opened to find Officer Jenkins, a guard well known for his connections to the Aryan Brotherhood, standing at his cell door with a smirk that promised trouble. "Cell search," Jenkins announced, his voice carrying artificial cheerfulness. "On your feet, Cole." Isaiah rose smoothly, his face betraying nothing of his internal wariness. He'd been expecting something like this. The guards had been too quiet lately, watching him with calculating eyes as he trained with other inmates in the yard. As soon as Isaiah stepped out of his cell, Jenkins roughly pushed him against the opposite wall, pressing his face against the cold concrete. Through the corner of his eye, Isaiah caught glimpse of movement. 2 white inmates slipping into his cell, their movements quick and practiced. He heard the sound of his mattress being lifted, then set back down. The whole thing took less than 30 seconds. The 2 inmates hurried away as Jenkins patted Isaiah down with unnecessary force. Well, another guard said, emerging from the cell. "Look what we found." In his hand was a crude shank, the kind commonly used in prison fights. Isaiah recognized it as one of the Aryan Brotherhood's preferred weapons, having seen similar ones during the shower ambush. The blade was still stained with what looked like dried blood. "Hands behind your back," Jenkins ordered, producing a pair of handcuffs. "You're taking a little trip to see the deputy warden." They marched Isaiah through the dark corridors of Redwood, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Other inmates pressed against their bars to watch, some shaking their heads in understanding. They'd seen this scene play out before. The deputy warden's office was brightly lit, a stark contrast to the dim prison halls. Clyde Mercer stood behind his desk, his massive frame casting a shadow across the room. His face bore an expression of mock disappointment as the guards pushed Isaiah into a chair. Well, Mercer said, holding up the planted shank. "What do we have here?" "A deadly weapon found in your cell, Cole. That makes you a threat to prison security." He turned the blade, letting the fluorescent lights glint off its crude edge. "You know what happens to threats in my prison?" Isaiah sat perfectly still, his posture straight despite the handcuffs binding his wrists. He met Mercer's gaze without flinching, saying nothing. No response? Mercer's fake smile turned cruel. "That's okay. Actions speak louder than words, don't they? And your actions tell me you need some time to think about your choices." He nodded to the guards. "Take him to the pit." The pit was Redwood's darkest secret, a special solitary confinement cell buried in the basement level of the prison. Unlike regular solitary cells, this one had no window, no proper ventilation, and was far enough from other cells that no sound could reach it. It was where prisoners were sent when the administration wanted them to disappear. The guards dragged Isaiah down flights of stairs, through a maze of maintenance corridors, and finally to a heavy steel door marked only with a number. They removed his handcuffs and shoved him inside without a word. The door slammed shut with a sound of finality, plunging Isaiah into complete darkness. The cell was barely large enough to lie down in. The air was stale and carried the musty smell of decay. In one corner, Isaiah could make out the outline of a bucket, his only bathroom facility. There was no bed, no sink, nothing but concrete and darkness. Isaiah sat cross-legged in the center of the cell, his back straight, his breathing steady. He began to center himself, drawing on years of SEAL training that had prepared him for situations exactly like this. In his mind, he could hear his instructors. The body follows the mind, control your situation. Outside the pit, Mercer stood in the corridor, phone pressed to his ear. Judge Beckett's number glowed on the screen. "It's done," Mercer reported, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Cole's in the pit." "How long will you keep him there?" Beckett asked. Mercer's lips curled into a cruel smile as he stared at the heavy steel door. "We'll let him rot." Meanwhile, Naomi Ellis sat at her desk surrounded by stacks of legal documents and case files. Her office was dimly lit by a single desk lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. In her hands, she held the latest disciplinary report from Redwood Penitentiary concerning Isaiah Cole. Her eyes narrowed as she read through the clearly fabricated charges. Possession of contraband weapon, threatening behavior, inciting unrest among inmates. She shook her head in disgust, knowing every word was a lie. The report was too perfect, too convenient, exactly the kind of setup she'd seen countless times before. She pulled out her phone and dialed her investigator. "Get me everything you can on Deputy Warden Clyde Mercer. I want his entire history. Complaints, incidents, everything." She paused, listening. "Yes, I'm going to Redwood myself." Something's not right. Meanwhile, deep within Redwood's concrete walls, Jamal paced in his cell, his boxer's instincts telling him time was running out. He'd heard whispers about the pit, about how inmates went in but didn't always come out. The thought of Isaiah down there fighting alone in the darkness made his hands clench into fists. "Hey, Martinez," he called softly to his cellmate. "Get word to the yard crew. It's time for that thing we talked about." Martinez nodded, understanding the coded message. Within hours, the plan was in motion, spreading through the prison's underground network of whispers and signals. Sarah Chen, a prison nurse who'd witnessed too many of Mercer's accidents, received the message during her rounds. The next morning, as the sun climbed over Redwood's walls, Jamal put the plan into action. He waited until yard time, when most of the inmates were outside under the watchful eyes of the guards. The tension in the air was thick, like the moment before a storm breaks. "Now!" Jamal shouted, and chaos erupted. Two rival gang members launched into a brutal fight near the basketball court. Within seconds, others joined in, following Jamal's carefully orchestrated script. The violence spread like wildfire across the yard, drawing guards from every corner of the prison. In the watchtower, a guard's voice crackled over the radio. "Multiple inmates fighting. We need backup in the yard." Mercer's voice responded immediately. "All available officers to the yard. Now." Just as planned, the guards abandoned their posts, rushing to contain the growing riot. In the confusion, Nurse Chen slipped through the now empty corridors, her heart pounding but her steps steady. She had the master key card, a privilege of her medical position, and she knew exactly where Isaiah was being held. The pit's door opened with a heavy groan. Isaiah sat in the darkness, still as a statue, but his eyes opened immediately. "Nurse Chen?" "We don't have much time," she whispered, helping him to his feet. "Can you walk?" Isaiah nodded, following her through the maze of maintenance corridors. Despite days without food or proper rest, his movements were controlled and precise. They made their way to his regular cell block, where Chen quickly unlocked his old cell. "Stay strong," she whispered before hurrying away, her white uniform disappearing around the corner. When the riot finally died down, the guards did their count and found Isaiah back in his regular cell. The news spread through the prison like electricity. Inmates watched through their bars as guards escorted Isaiah to the yard for his regular time, his face showing signs of his ordeal, but his back straight and his steps unwavering. Other prisoners nodded respectfully as he passed. Some touched their hearts in silent solidarity. The message was clear. Isaiah Cole couldn't be broken, not even by the pit. In the watchtower, Mercer watched through narrowed eyes as Isaiah walked across the yard. His massive hands clenched the railing until his knuckles turned white. This wasn't supposed to happen. No one escaped the pit. No one came back stronger. "This ends now," he growled, turning away from the window. He grabbed his radio and called two of his most brutal officers to his office. That night, after lights out, Officers Reeves and Sullivan approached Isaiah's cell. They carried batons and wore brass knuckles, their faces twisted with anticipation of violence. The cell door opened with a metallic screech. "Time for your medicine, Cole," Reeves sneered, slapping his baton against his palm. Isaiah rose from his bunk slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. Despite days in the pit, despite hunger and exhaustion, his eyes were clear and focused. He'd been waiting for this. Sullivan swung first, his brass knuckles cutting through the air. But Isaiah was already moving, years of SEAL training taking over. He caught Sullivan's arm and twisted, using the man's momentum against him. The crack of bone breaking echoed through the cell. Reeves charged forward with his baton, but Isaiah ducked under the swing. His fist connected with Reeves's nose, sending a spray of blood across the cell wall. The guard staggered backward, dropping his weapon. The fight was over in seconds. Sullivan lay unconscious on the floor, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. Reeves slumped against the wall, blood pouring from his ruined nose, his eyes wide with shock and fear. In his office, Mercer watched the security footage with growing horror. He'd seen Isaiah fight before, but this was different. This wasn't just survival, this was mastery. Even after everything they'd done to him, Isaiah moved like a predator, controlled and lethal. For the first time since taking control of Redwood, Mercer felt real fear. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Isaiah wasn't breaking under the pressure. He was getting stronger. Every attempt to crush him only made him more dangerous. His phone rang, Judge Beckett's number flashing on the screen. Mercer answered with trembling fingers. "Execute him." Beckett's voice was cold and final. "Now." The next day, the morning sun cast long shadows through Judge Beckett's office window as he held the emergency execution order in his trembling hands. His signature would seal Isaiah Cole's fate, accelerating what should have been years of appeals into just 7 days. A cruel smile played across his thin lips as he pressed pen to paper. "Let's see you fight your way out of this one," he muttered, signing with an elaborate flourish. The document felt heavy in his hands, not from its physical weight, but from the finality of what it represented. At Redwood Penitentiary, Deputy Warden Mercer practically skipped down death row, the signed order clutched in his meaty fist. His boots echoed against the concrete floor, a rhythmic sound that announced his approach to the condemned men in their cells. But he only had eyes for one prisoner today. Isaiah sat on his bunk, back straight against the wall, eyes closed in meditation. He didn't open them when Mercer's shadow fell across his cell. "Rise and shine, super soldier," Mercer called out, his voice dripping with mock cheerfulness. He pressed his face close to the bars, wanting to savor every moment. "Got some special news for you today." Isaiah's eyes opened slowly, revealing that same unnerving calm that had begun to haunt Mercer's dreams. The deputy warden held up the execution order, making sure Isaiah could see the official seal and Beckett's signature. 7 days, Mercer announced, tapping the date with his finger. "That's all you've got left." Judge Beckett signed the emergency order himself. No more appeals, no more chances. He licked his lips, expecting, hoping, to finally see fear crack through Isaiah's composure. Instead, Isaiah rose from his bunk with fluid grace, moving to stand directly in front of Mercer. Despite the bars between them, Mercer found himself taking a small step back. Isaiah's voice came out low and steady, each word carefully measured. "You better pray I don't walk out of here." The threat hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Mercer felt a chill run down his spine. He covered his unease with a forced laugh that echoed hollowly through the corridor. Across town, in a small coffee shop far from prying eyes, Naomi Ellis sat across from David Whitmore, Isaiah's former SEAL commander. David's presence filled the booth, not just from his physical size, but from the intensity he carried. His eyes constantly scanned the room, a habit born from years of combat. Between them sat Sarah Chen, a young investigative journalist known for exposing corruption. Her laptop was open, displaying classified military documents that David had brought. "These prove everything," Naomi said, pointing to the screen. "Operation dates, mission logs, satellite imagery. Isaiah was conducting classified operations in Yemen when the murder happened. He couldn't possibly have been in the country." David nodded grimly. "I pulled every string I had to get these declassified. Some people owed me favors, big ones. I called them all in for Isaiah." Sarah studied the documents, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she took notes. "This is explosive stuff. Multiple missions, all officially documented. Eyewitness accounts from other SEALs. There's no way they can ignore this." "They'll try," David growled. "Beckett and his cronies have been burying evidence for years, but let's see them bury this." Within hours, Sarah's article hit the internet. Social media exploded with outrage. News networks picked up the story, running headlines about the wrongfully convicted SEAL on death row. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their numbers growing by the hour. Judge Beckett appeared on the evening news, his face flushed but his voice steady as he addressed the cameras. He stood at a podium, American flags arranged behind him, playing every bit the part of the concerned public servant. "These so-called documents are nothing but a desperate attempt by a dangerous criminal to manipulate the system," he declared, adjusting his tie. "Isaiah Cole is a disgrace to the uniform he once wore. He used his military training to commit murder, and now he's using it to create chaos in our prison system. The governor's office released a statement shortly after. While we take all claims of wrongful conviction seriously, we cannot intervene without absolute, irrefutable proof of innocence. The emergency execution order stands. Back in Redwood's exercise yard, tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. Black and Latino inmates gathered in small groups, their conversations hushed but intense. Guards watched nervously from the towers, sensing the shift in power. Jamal approached Isaiah, who was doing pull-ups on the exercise bars. Other inmates formed a loose circle around them, providing privacy while keeping watch for guards. "You got 7 days," Jamal said quietly, his boxer's hands clenched at his sides. "We're getting you out of here." Isaiah dropped from the bar, landing silently despite his chains. He looked at the faces around him, men who had been broken by the system, men who had lost hope until they saw him stand up to Mercer and his thugs. Now they stood ready to risk everything to help him. "We're getting you out," Jamal repeated, and the others nodded in agreement. The whole system's corrupt, but they messed with the wrong man this time. Isaiah looked at each face in turn, acknowledging their commitment with a slight nod. The war for his survival had begun, and he wasn't fighting alone anymore. Hours later, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Isaiah sat at a metal table in the prison library, surrounded by a small group of trusted inmates. Jamal stood beside him, his muscular frame blocking the view from the guard station. On the table, carefully hidden behind stacked books, lay a crude map of Redwood's administrative wing. "Guard rotation changes at midnight," Jamal whispered, pointing to specific locations on the map. "Thompson takes his coffee break at 12:15, leaves his post for exactly 7 minutes. That's our window to get past the first checkpoint." Isaiah nodded, his eyes scanning the makeshift blueprint. Years of military training had taught him to spot patterns, weaknesses, and opportunities. Redwood might be a fortress, but like any fortress, it had vulnerabilities. "Martinez works in maintenance," another inmate named Carlos added, keeping his voice low. "Says the security cameras in the admin wing got damaged last month. They installed new ones, but the system glitches every night around midnight, blacks out for about 30 seconds. "How sure are you about this?" Isaiah asked, his intense gaze fixed on Carlos. "He's the one who installed them," Carlos replied with a slight smile. "Didn't do the best job on purpose, if you know what I mean." Isaiah's fingers traced the path to the warden's office. He'd memorized every turn, every door, every potential obstacle. But more importantly, he knew what they were looking for. Mercer kept detailed records of his illegal activities, proof of inmate abuse, drug smuggling operations, and staged fights that had left prisoners dead. "Remember," Isaiah said, addressing the small group, "this isn't about escape, it's about exposure. We get those files out, and the whole system comes crashing down." Jamal placed a hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "We got your back, brother. 7 days ain't much time, but it's enough to make these bastards pay." As the day wore on, they refined their plan. Each man memorized his role, understanding that the slightest mistake could cost them everything. Isaiah watched them with pride. These men, branded as criminals by society, showing more courage and integrity than the corrupt officials who imprisoned them. When night fell, the prison grew quiet except for the occasional echo of boots on concrete and the metallic clang of cell doors. Isaiah lay on his bunk, counting the minutes, waiting for the perfect moment. At exactly midnight, he heard the soft click he'd been waiting for. Jamal had managed to jam his cell lock during the evening count. Moving silently, Isaiah slipped out of his cell. The darkness wrapped around him like an old friend, providing cover as he made his way to where Jamal waited. They moved through the shadows, their movements synchronized from weeks of planning. They reached the first checkpoint just as Thompson left for his coffee break. 7 minutes. They slipped past the empty guard station, their soft-soled prison shoes silent against the floor. The administrative wing loomed ahead, its dark windows like empty eyes watching their approach. Just as Carlos had promised, the security cameras went dark as they reached the final corridor. 30 seconds. They moved quickly but carefully, reaching the warden's office door. Jamal produced a makeshift lockpick, crafted from stolen maintenance tools, and went to work on the lock. The door opened with a soft click and they slipped inside. The office was dark except for the dim glow of emergency exit signs. Isaiah moved straight to the filing cabinets while Jamal kept watch at the door. The files were exactly where their inside source said they would be. Isaiah's trained hands moved quickly through the folders, finding damning evidence with each pull. Reports of inmate deaths labeled as accidents. Financial records showing payments to white supremacist gang leaders. And there, in a separate folder, the execution orders, complete with notes revealing the conspiracy between Mercer and Beckett. Isaiah pulled a small flash drive from his mouth. He'd kept it hidden there since another inmate had smuggled it in. He moved to Mercer's computer, ready to copy the digital files. That's when the alarm blared. Red lights began flashing and the sound of boots thundered through the corridors. Jamal tensed at the door. They're coming from both sides. Isaiah worked frantically, copying as many files as he could while Jamal barricaded the door with a chair. The flash drive blinked as it downloaded the evidence, each second feeling like an eternity. The door burst open, sending Jamal stumbling backward. Guards flooded in, batons raised. Isaiah managed to grab the flash drive just as the first blow struck him across the back. They fought back, but they were outnumbered. The guards showed no mercy, their batons rising and falling with practiced cruelty. Isaiah felt his ribs crack under the assault, but he kept his right hand clenched tight, protecting the precious flash drive. The guards dragged them through the corridors, their bodies leaving trails of blood on the concrete floor. Other inmates pressed against their cell bars, watching in silent solidarity as their champions were beaten. Back in his cell, Isaiah lay on the cold floor, his body screaming in pain. Mercer appeared at the bars, his face twisted in a triumphant sneer. He leaned in close, his breath hot and rank. "You really thought you could win?" Mercer whispered, savoring each word. The guards walked away, their laughter echoing through the cell block. Isaiah remained motionless until the sound of their boots faded completely. Then, slowly, painfully, he opened his bloody hand. The flash drive was still there, intact despite the beating. He stared up at the ceiling, his broken lips forming words that carried both defiance and promise. "I'm still here." The dim light filtering through Isaiah's cell window cast long shadows across the concrete floor. His body ached from the savage beating 2 nights ago, each breath sending sharp pains through his bruised ribs. He sat on his thin mattress back against the cold wall, watching dust particles dance in the weak beam of light. Redwood felt different now. The usual cacophony of prison life had been replaced by an eerie quiet, as if the entire facility was holding its breath. 2 days. Just 48 hours until his scheduled execution. The thought didn't frighten him as much as it should have, but he felt the weight of it pressing down on the entire prison. Through his tiny window, he could hear the distant chants of protesters. Their voices carried over the prison walls. Justice for Isaiah and stop the execution. The leaked files had sparked outrage across the country. News channels ran constant coverage of the corruption at Redwood, showing grainy photos of Isaiah's military service alongside footage of the protests. But inside these walls, Isaiah was alone. Jamal and the others who had helped him were locked away in solitary confinement, their punishment for participating in the break-in. Those who remained free were too terrified to make eye contact, let alone offer support. The Aryan Brotherhood strutted around the yard with renewed confidence, knowing their protection from Mercer was secure for now. During mealtimes, Isaiah sat by himself. The dining hall, usually buzzing with conversation, fell into uncomfortable silence whenever he entered. Other inmates quickly looked away, their fear of association evident in their hunched shoulders and averted gazes. The guards watched him constantly, their hands resting on their batons, hoping he'd give them an excuse to strike. In his cell, Isaiah maintained his routine despite the pain. Push-ups, sit-ups, squats, anything to keep his mind focused and his body ready. Each movement sent waves of agony through his battered torso, but he welcomed the pain. It reminded him he was still alive, still fighting. The afternoon sun cast orange light across his cell when he heard the familiar click-clack of expensive shoes on concrete. Naomi Ellis, his lawyer, appeared at his cell door, her face tight with frustration and exhaustion. A guard unlocked the door to let her in. "They're blocking everything," she said, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Beckett's denying every emergency motion we file. He won't even look at the new evidence." Her voice carried the weight of countless sleepless nights and legal battles. Isaiah nodded, unsurprised. "Beckett's desperate. He knows if this goes to another judge, everything falls apart." "The governor's office called for an internal investigation," Naomi continued, a slight spark of hope in her eyes. "The files we leaked, they're causing waves. Major news networks are picking up the story. People are demanding answers." Before Isaiah could respond, heavy footsteps approached his cell. Deputy Warden Mercer appeared, his massive frame filling the doorway. His usual smirk was replaced by something tighter, more strained. "Time's up, counselor," Mercer barked at Naomi. "Say goodbye to your client." Naomi stood, straightening her suit jacket. "This isn't over, Mr. Mercer, the governor dash." "The governor can investigate all he wants," Mercer cut her off. "But in 48 hours, your client gets the needle. Now leave." After Naomi was escorted out, Mercer stepped into the cell, closing the door behind him. His presence filled the small space with tension. Isaiah remained seated, his face impassive as he looked up at the man who had tormented him for months. "The governor's sniffing around," Mercer said, his voice low and threatening. "Making phone calls, asking questions. But it's too late. You die in 48 hours. His words carried a hint of desperation that Isaiah hadn't heard before. Isaiah's lips curved into a slight smirk. "You sound nervous, Mercer." The deputy warden's jaw clenched, a vein pulsing in his thick neck. For a moment, he looked like he might lash out, but he controlled himself. Instead, he forced a cruel smile. "Enjoy your last meal," Mercer spat, turning to leave. The cell door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the quiet cell block. Once alone, Isaiah reached into his prison jumpsuit, fingers finding the small flash drive hidden in a carefully sewn pocket. He stood slowly, ribs protesting, and walked to his tiny window. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. The protesters' chants had grown louder as darkness approached. He held the flash drive tightly, feeling its edges press into his palm. This small piece of plastic and metal contained enough evidence to bring down not just Mercer and Beckett, but the entire corrupt system they represented. Isaiah stared out the window, his voice barely a whisper in the growing darkness. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Days later, the morning sun crept through Judge Beckett's bedroom curtains, but it wasn't the light that woke him. His phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand, vibrating with an endless stream of calls and notifications. Groaning, he reached for it, squinting at the bright screen. His heart stopped when he saw the headlines. "Corrupt judge exposed, evidence shows pattern of racial bias and prison corruption." Breaking, Judge Samuel Beckett linked to prison abuse scandal. Death row inmate Isaiah Cole's case under scrutiny after new evidence emerges. His own face stared back at him from every news website. Photos from court appearances, social events, and private meetings that should have remained secret. Below them were damning excerpts from emails, court documents, and private correspondence with Deputy Warden Mercer. Beckett's hands trembled as he scrolled through article after article. They had everything: his communications with Mercer about handling Isaiah, records of suspicious sentencing patterns showing clear racial bias, and evidence of his involvement in covering up prison abuse. The sharp ring of his doorbell cut through the morning silence, then another ring, and another. Through his second-story window he saw them. Dozens of reporters crowding his front lawn, their cameras and microphones pointed at his house like weapons. News vans lined his normally quiet suburban street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. "Judge Beckett," they shouted, "what do you have to say about the allegations? Did you deliberately falsify evidence in the Isaiah Cole case? How long have you been working with corrupt prison officials?" Inside Redwood Penitentiary, chaos erupted as Deputy Warden Mercer stormed through the corridors, his face red with rage. Guards scrambled to attention as he passed, barking orders into his radio. "I want this entire facility locked down," he shouted. No one in or out without my direct authorization. Any inmate caught sharing information gets thrown in solitary." The prison descended into tense silence as cell doors slammed shut and guards took up strategic positions. In the control room, Mercer watched the security monitors with bloodshot eyes, searching for any sign of information leaving his domain. A guard knocked on the control room door. "Sir, Isaiah Cole has visitors. His lawyer and some military guy." Mercer's jaw clenched. "Search them thoroughly. I want eyes and ears on that meeting." In the visitation room, Isaiah sat across from Naomi Ellis and Commander David Whitmore. Despite the bruises on his face and the pain in his ribs, he sat straight-backed and alert. Two guards stood nearby, watching their every move. Whitmore, still impressive in his civilian clothes, leaned forward slightly. His voice was barely above a whisper, but his words carried clearly to Isaiah. "We have the governor's ear, but we need more proof." Isaiah's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered briefly to the guards before returning to his visitors. With practiced smoothness, he shifted in his chair, his hand brushing against the hidden pocket in his jumpsuit. Naomi reached across the table, pretending to straighten some legal papers. Her hand met Isaiah's for just a moment, long enough for the small flash drive to pass between them. She slipped it into her sleeve without missing a beat. "We'll keep fighting," she said loudly for the benefit of the guards. "The appeals process isn't over yet." That night, while Mercer paced his office and Beckett hid from reporters, Naomi sat in her home office, connecting the flash drive to her computer. Her hands shook slightly as she opened the files. Videos of guard brutality, financial records showing kickbacks, emails discussing staged fights and drug smuggling, and most damning of all, detailed plans to silence Isaiah permanently. With a deep breath, she began uploading everything to multiple news outlets and social media platforms. Within hours, the internet exploded with the revelations. In his study, Beckett sat in his leather armchair, a glass of whiskey trembling in his hand as he watched the news unfold on his large flat-screen TV. His phone had long since been turned off, unable to handle the constant barrage of calls and messages. The news anchor's voice filled the room. "In a shocking development, thousands of documents have been leaked showing widespread corruption in the state's justice system. At the center of the scandal are Judge Samuel Beckett and Deputy Warden Clyde Mercer of Redwood Penitentiary." Beckett drained his glass, pouring another with unsteady hands. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. Decades of power, influence, and carefully hidden prejudices, all exposed in a single night. The TV screen switched to a live press conference. The governor stood at a podium, surrounded by officials and advisors. His face was grave as he addressed the cameras. "In light of these disturbing revelations, I am announcing an immediate formal review of Isaiah Cole's case," the governor declared. "Furthermore, I have ordered a complete investigation into all cases presided over by Judge Beckett, as well as a full audit of Redwood Penitentiary's operations under Deputy Warden Mercer." Beckett's face contorted with rage. The glass in his hand flew across the room, shattering against the TV screen. Whiskey and glass rained down as he leaped to his feet. "This isn't over," he screamed at the sparking television, his voice echoing through his empty house. But the governor's words continued to play through the damaged screen, each announcement another nail in the coffin of Beckett's career and reputation. The morning dawned cold and gray over Redwood Penitentiary. Two guards approached Isaiah's cell, their boots echoing against the metal walkway. Their faces were drawn, shoulders tense. This wasn't a normal prisoner transfer, and they knew it. "Cole," the first guard called out, his voice quieter than usual. "Time to move." Isaiah stood slowly from his bunk, his orange jumpsuit crisp and neat despite everything. He'd spent the morning doing push-ups and sit-ups, refusing to show any weakness. Now, as the cell door slid open with a metallic screech, he held his head high. The guards avoided his gaze as they cuffed his hands and feet. These weren't Mercer's usual thugs. They were regular officers who'd watched Isaiah over the months, seen his dignity, witnessed his impact on other inmates. One of them, Johnson, had even stopped a beating last week. Now his hands trembled slightly as he secured the chains. "Protocol requires full restraint," Johnson mumbled almost apologetically. Isaiah nodded. "Do what you have to do." They led him through the prison's winding corridors, past cells where inmates pressed against the bars. Some called out words of support, others stood in respectful silence. The entire prison seemed to hold its breath as Isaiah made his final walk. The execution holding cell was smaller than his regular cell, with stark white walls and bright fluorescent lights that never dimmed. A narrow cot sat against one wall, and a small table held what was meant to be his last meal: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and apple pie. The food steamed gently, but Isaiah didn't even glance at it as the guards removed his restraints. "You have 6 hours," Johnson said, his voice catching slightly. "The chaplain will be available if you want him." Isaiah stood in the center of the cell, his back straight, his eyes focused on some distant point. No chaplain, just quiet. The guards nodded and retreated, the heavy door closing with a final sounding thud. Through the small window in the door, they could see Isaiah standing perfectly still, like a statue carved from stone. Outside the prison walls, the scene was anything but quiet. Thousands of protesters had gathered, their signs and banners creating a sea of color against the prison's gray walls. They chanted Isaiah's name, demanded justice, called for Beckett's arrest. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing the growing crowd. In the governor's office, Naomi Ellis and Commander Whitmore stood before the large mahogany desk, their faces tight with urgency. The governor, a man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, paced behind his desk. "The evidence is overwhelming," Naomi insisted, spreading documents across his desk. "Look at these records. Proof of judicial misconduct, corruption at every level. You can't let this execution proceed." Whitmore stepped forward, his military bearing commanding attention. "Sir, I've commanded hundreds of men in combat. Isaiah Cole is one of the finest soldiers I've ever known. He saved my life and the lives of our entire unit in Afghanistan. The idea that he would commit murder while deployed overseas is absurd." The governor picked up one of the documents, his brow furrowed. "I understand your concerns, but overruling a court order, even one from Judge Beckett, sets a dangerous precedent. The legal system has processes for appeals. Processes that Beckett has deliberately blocked at every turn," Naomi cut in. "Sir, in 6 hours, an innocent man will die because a racist judge and a corrupt prison system want to silence him. You're the only one who can stop this." The governor sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. News footage played silently on a TV mounted on his wall, showing the massive crowds outside Redwood. The political implications were clear, but so were the moral ones. Across town, in a television studio, Judge Samuel Beckett sat under bright lights, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit immaculate. He smiled coldly at the interviewer, showing no sign of the pressure he was under. "Tomorrow justice will finally be served," he said smoothly. "Isaiah Cole is a convicted murderer who has continued to demonstrate violent tendencies even in prison. The governor would be wise to let the legal system do its job." "But what about the new evidence?" the interviewer pressed. "The military records showing he was overseas during the murder? The allegations of corruption at Redwood?" Beckett's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "Desperate, last-minute attempts by his supporters to delay the inevitable. Justice will be served tomorrow. That's all I have to say on the matter." Back in the holding cell, Isaiah sat cross-legged on the floor, his breathing steady and controlled. The untouched meal had grown cold, but he paid it no attention. His mind was clear, focused, drawing on years of SEAL training. He remembered the endless hours in Bud S training, learning to control his mind and body under extreme stress. The instructors had tried everything to break him: cold water, sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion. But he never quit, never broke. The meditation techniques they'd taught him came naturally now. His breathing slowed, his muscles relaxed, even as his mind remained sharp. He could hear the distant sounds of the protesters, the occasional footsteps of guards checking on him, the hum of the fluorescent lights. Death didn't frighten him. He'd faced it many times before, in combat, in training, in the dark cells of Redwood. But acceptance wasn't the same as surrender. Every fiber of his being rejected the idea of letting Beckett win, of letting corruption triumph over truth. The hour grew late, and the prison began its nightly lockdown procedures. Soon, they would come to prepare him for the execution chamber. Isaiah remained perfectly still, his mind clear, his resolve unshaken. He had looked death in the face too many times to fear it now. But as he sat in his final hour of freedom, Isaiah Cole made no peace with his fate. He wouldn't accept an unjust death, wouldn't give Beckett and Mercer the satisfaction of breaking him. His body might be confined, but his spirit remained undefeated, unbowed, unbroken. The first rays of dawn crept through the narrow window of Isaiah's holding cell, casting long shadows across the cold floor. The heavy sound of boots echoed down the corridor, growing louder with each step. Isaiah remained seated cross-legged on the floor, his eyes closed, his breathing steady. The cell door opened with a metallic groan. 4 guards entered, led by Deputy Warden Mercer himself. His face wore a triumphant smirk as he surveyed the scene. The untouched last meal, Isaiah's meditative pose, the absolute stillness of the cell. "Time's up, Cole," Mercer announced, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "On your feet." Isaiah opened his eyes slowly, deliberately. He rose with fluid grace, his movements controlled and precise despite the hours of sitting still. The guards approached with restraints, but there was tension in their movements, uncertainty in their eyes. They secured his wrists and ankles with heavy chains, then guided him to the waiting gurney. The white surface gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, its leather straps dark against the sterile padding. Isaiah allowed them to help him onto it, his face betraying no emotion as they secured the straps across his chest, legs, and arms. Mercer leaned in close as the guards finished their work, his breath hot against Isaiah's ear. "You lose," he whispered, voice thick with malice. "All that fighting, all that resistance, and here you are anyway, strapped down like an animal." Isaiah turned his head slightly, meeting Mercer's gaze. His eyes burned with such intensity that Mercer involuntarily stepped back. Even now, bound and minutes from death, Isaiah's presence commanded respect and radiated strength. The guards began wheeling the gurney down the long corridor toward the execution chamber. The wheels squeaked against the floor, a high-pitched counterpoint to the heavy sound of boots. They passed rows of cells, where inmates stood in silence watching their brother's final journey. Across town, Naomi Ellis and Commander Whitmore burst through the doors of the governor's office, startling his secretary, who jumped to her feet. "We need to see him now," Naomi demanded, clutching a small recorder in her hand. "It's a matter of life and death." The secretary reached for her phone, but the governor's door flew open. He stood there in his shirt sleeves, tie loosened, looking haggard from a sleepless night. "Let them in," he ordered, retreating to his desk. Naomi and Whitmore rushed into the office. Without preamble, Naomi slammed the recorder onto the governor's desk and hit play. A scratchy voice filled the room, one of Mercer's former guards, speaking from a safe house. "Yeah, we framed Cole," the voice said clearly. "Beckett ordered it, said he needed to make an example of him. Mercer helped plant the evidence, intimidate witnesses. Cole was overseas when the murder happened, we all knew it. But Beckett wanted him gone, and what Beckett wants, he gets." The governor's face drained of color as the recording continued, detailing dates, names, and specific instances of evidence tampering. He sank into his chair, running a trembling hand through his silver hair. "Dear God," he whispered, "if Cole dies now, your political career will be over," Whitmore finished firmly. "You'll be remembered as the governor who allowed an innocent war hero to be executed despite clear evidence of judicial corruption." The governor's hand shot out, grabbing his phone. "Get me the warden at Redwood," he barked at his secretary through the intercom. "Now." Inside Redwood's execution chamber, the preparations continued with mechanical precision. Medical technicians checked IV lines while witnesses filed into the observation room. Through the large window, Isaiah could see reporters taking their seats, their faces grim. The prison chaplain stood nearby, Bible in hand, but Isaiah had declined his services. He lay strapped to the gurney, his mind clear, his breathing controlled. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their harsh glare reflecting off the metal instruments arranged nearby. A technician swabbed his arm with alcohol, the sharp smell cutting through the sterile air. Another checked the various monitors that would record his vital signs as the lethal cocktail of drugs did its work. The warden stood by the door, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression growing increasingly agitated. He stepped out into the hallway, his voice raised but muffled through the thick door. Isaiah closed his eyes, remembering his mother's face, his years of service, the men he'd served with. He thought of the inmates he'd helped, the lives he'd touched even behind these walls. If this was the end, he would face it with the same courage and dignity he'd shown throughout his life. The needle hovered over his arm. Suddenly, the chamber doors burst open with a bang. The warden rushed in, his face flushed, phone still in hand. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. "The governor just issued a pardon." The medical technician jerked back, the needle missing Isaiah's arm by inches. The witnesses in the observation room stood up, pressing against the glass. Cameras flashed as reporters rushed to be the first to break the news. Isaiah opened his eyes, turning his head to look at the warden. He was alive. The truth had finally come to light. The room erupted into chaos. Guards rushed to undo his restraints while the warden barked orders into his phone. Through the observation window, reporters were already running for the exits, racing to file their stories. In the doorway, Mercer stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. His carefully constructed kingdom was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Isaiah sat up slowly as the last strap was removed, rubbing his wrists where the restraints had been. His face remained calm, but his eyes blazed with vindication. He had refused to break, refused to give up, and now the truth had set him free. Meanwhile, Judge Samuel Beckett's hand trembled as he gripped his crystal whiskey glass, his knuckles white with tension. The afternoon sun filtered through his office windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk cluttered with newspapers. Their headlines screamed at him in bold black letters: "Isaiah Cole pardoned. Governor's last-minute intervention saves innocent man. War hero escapes death row." His phone hadn't stopped ringing for hours. The constant buzzing felt like needles in his skull, each call representing another crack in his carefully constructed facade. He glanced at the caller ID. Channel 7 News. Ignore. The Washington Post. Ignore. The State Bar Association. His finger hovered over that one before he let it go to voicemail. The wall-mounted TV droned on, its volume low but every word crystal clear. In a dramatic turn of events, Isaiah Cole, the decorated Navy SEAL convicted of murder, was granted a last-minute pardon by Governor Matthews. Sources say new evidence revealed widespread corruption in the original trial. Beckett's face flushed deep red, the veins in his neck bulging. His grip on the whiskey glass tightened until his entire arm shook with rage. "That bastard should be dead," he roared, hurling the glass against the wall. It shattered with a satisfying crash, amber liquid streaming down the expensive wallpaper like tears. He stabbed at his phone's screen, pulling up numbers he hadn't called in months. Senator Thompson's office. "I'm sorry, the senator is unavailable." Judge Martinez. "Please leave a message." District Attorney Phillips. "Now's not a good time, Sam." Each rejection twisted the knife deeper. These were people who had dined at his home, who had benefited from his influence, who had praised his tough-on-crime stance. Now they couldn't distance themselves fast enough. His email pinged. The subject line made his stomach lurch. Notice of ethics investigation. Immediate response required. The state bar wasn't waiting around. His private line rang, one of the few calls he'd been waiting for. Deputy Warden Mercer's voice crackled through the speaker, high-pitched with panic. "They're crawling all over Redwood," Mercer hissed. "FBI, state police, internal affairs. They're pulling files, interviewing guards. They know about the fight clubs, the drug running, everything. What the hell do we do?" Beckett's lip curled into a sneer. Even now, Mercer sounded like a scared child running to Daddy. "We do what we've always done, Clyde," he spat. "We bury the evidence." "But shut up and listen," Beckett cut him off. "Destroy everything. Files, videos, anything that could link us. If anyone talks, they go down with us. Understand?" "Yeah, boss, I understand." Beckett hung up, his hands still shaking. He reached for another glass, needing something to steady his nerves. The bottle was almost empty. A knock at his office door made him jump, whiskey sloshing over the rim. "What?" he barked. The door creaked open slowly. Tommy Chen, one of the younger clerks, stepped inside. The boy's face was pale, his hands clutching a stack of papers so tightly they crumpled at the edges. "Sir," Tommy's voice quavered, I thought you should know right away. The Supreme Court just announced they're reviewing your prior cases." Beckett stared at him, the words not quite registering. "What did you just say?" "All of them, sir. Every case from the past 15 years. They're looking for patterns of racial bias and procedural misconduct." The whiskey glass slipped from Beckett's fingers, thumping softly into the plush carpet. For the first time since this nightmare began, real fear crept into his eyes. 15 years of cases, hundreds of convictions, all those carefully worded opinions, all those strategic jury selections, all those random traffic stops that somehow always caught the right kind of suspect. Tommy still stood in the doorway, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. Should I call your attorney, sir?" Beckett couldn't answer. His throat had closed up, his chest tight with panic. The walls of his office, walls covered in awards, certificates, and photographs with powerful people, seemed to be closing in. Each face in those photos was now a potential enemy, each handshake captured on film now a liability. The TV droned on in the background, but now he could hear every word with painful clarity. "Legal experts suggest this could be one of the largest judicial misconduct cases in state history. Sources close to the investigation say Judge Beckett's relationship with Deputy Warden Mercer raises serious questions about corruption within the criminal justice system." The next day, the morning sun cast long shadows across Redwood Penitentiary's yard as state investigators swarmed the grounds like ants on a disturbed hill. Deputy Warden Clyde Mercer stood at his office window, his normally crisp uniform now wrinkled and damp with sweat. His meaty fingers drummed nervously against the windowsill as he watched the scene unfold below. The empire he'd built through fear and violence was crumbling before his eyes. Men and women in dark suits moved purposefully through the prison corridors, clipboards and tablets in hand. They stopped guards mid-patrol, pulling them aside for questioning. The guards' faces told the story. Some looked terrified, others resigned. A few met Mercer's gaze through the window and quickly looked away, the betrayal in their eyes unmistakable. These were men who had followed his orders without question for years. In the yard, investigators spoke with inmates in hushed tones. Prisoners who had never dared speak up before were now pointing toward the guard towers, gesturing at specific cells, describing incidents in detail. The invisible wall of fear that had kept them silent was crumbling. Stories of beatings, extortion, and worse, flowed freely now that protection had arrived. Mercer's office felt smaller by the minute. The walls seemed to inch closer with each passing second. His eyes darted to the filing cabinet in the corner, still stuffed with incident reports he hadn't had time to destroy. The computer on his desk contained years of emails that could bury him. Everything he'd built, every system of control and corruption, was unraveling like a cheap sweater caught on a nail. A knock at his door made him jump. "What?" he barked, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor in his voice. "Sir," his secretary's voice wavered. "The state investigators want to see all disciplinary records from the past 5 years. They have a warrant." Her usual confidence had vanished, replaced by the nervous tone of someone who knew the ship was sinking. Mercer loosened his collar, feeling the noose tightening. Tell them I'm compiling them." He tugged at his tie, suddenly finding it hard to breathe in the stuffy office. Outside his window, more official vehicles pulled into the parking lot. He recognized the logos: Internal Affairs, FBI, State Police. The vultures were circling, ready to pick his bones clean. Across town, on the steps of the state capitol, Isaiah Cole stood at a podium, his posture military straight despite the weeks of abuse he'd endured. Camera flashes punctuated the morning air as reporters jostled for position. Naomi Ellis stood beside him, her face set with determination. The crowd hung on every word, hungry for justice. "What happened at Redwood wasn't just about me," Isaiah's voice carried across the crowd, strong and clear. It was about a system of abuse that's gone unchecked for years. Men were beaten, tortured, and some died under mysterious circumstances, all while Deputy Warden Mercer and his corrupt guards profited. His voice never wavered, carrying the weight of hundreds of untold stories. Naomi stepped forward, holding up a thick folder. We have documented evidence of systematic abuse dating back over a decade. Illegal fight clubs organized by guards, drug trafficking operations run through the prison commissary, false incident reports used to extend sentences or justify solitary confinement. The list goes on. Her eyes flashed with righteous anger as she spoke, her voice steady and powerful. The crowd murmured as she detailed specific incidents, dates, names, locations. Journalists' fingers flew across keyboards. Cameras zoomed in on the documents she displayed. The truth, hidden for so long, was finally seeing daylight. Inside the governor's office, Matthews watched the press conference on TV, his face growing darker with each revelation. He grabbed his phone, jabbing at the keypad, knuckles white with anger. This is Governor Matthews. His voice was steel. I want Deputy Warden Mercer arrested immediately. No warnings, no courtesy calls. Just get him out of that prison. He slammed the phone down, knowing his own political future hung in the balance. Back at Redwood, Mercer's secretary burst into his office without knocking. Sir, they're coming up the stairs. Her face was pale with panic. Mercer's chair crashed backward as he stood. His eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. The main entrance was already blocked. He could hear voices in the hallway. That left only one option. He grabbed his jacket and keys, rushing to the back door. His emergency exit, installed years ago for exactly this type of situation. His hands shook as he fumbled with the lock, sweat beading on his forehead. The voices grew closer. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, getting louder with each passing second. Finally, the door clicked open. Mercer yanked it wide, ready to sprint down the maintenance stairs to the parking lot where his car waited. Instead, he froze. 4 federal agents stood on the landing, their badges gleaming in the fluorescent light. Behind them, Isaiah Cole leaned against the railing, his face unreadable. His calm presence was a stark contrast to Mercer's panic. Deputy Warden Clyde Mercer, one agent stepped forward, handcuffs ready. You're under arrest for corruption, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and accessory to multiple counts of assault and battery. This is ridiculous, Mercer sputtered, his face turning purple. You can't. I'm the deputy warden. I run this prison. Spittle flew from his mouth as his world collapsed around him. Not anymore, the agent said, spinning him around to cuff him. The cold metal snapped around his wrists with finality. As they led Mercer past Isaiah, the former SEAL's expression remained neutral, but his eyes burned with quiet satisfaction. The tables had turned completely. Tough luck, huh? Isaiah said softly, then turned away without waiting for a response. The simple words carried the weight of all the suffering Mercer had inflicted. Mercer could only watch, helpless, as Isaiah's back disappeared down the stairs, a free man walking away while he faced a cell of his own. Justice had finally come full circle. Days later, the marble halls of the courthouse felt different to Samuel Beckett now. For decades, he had walked these corridors like a king, his black robes flowing behind him, commanding respect and fear. But today, wearing a plain gray suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame, he shuffled forward like a common criminal. Camera flashes exploded in his face as he approached the entrance to Courtroom B. Reporters thrust microphones toward him, their questions overlapping in a cacophony of accusations. Judge Beckett, how do you respond to allegations of systematic racism? Did you deliberately target black defendants throughout your career? What's your connection to the corrupt prison system? Beckett kept his head down, his attorney trying to clear a path through the media circus. But he couldn't block out the whispers that followed him. Whispers from his own colleagues, judges, and lawyers he'd worked with for years. Can you believe it? One clerk muttered. All those cases he handled. Always knew something was off about him, a bailiff responded. Guess the robes can't hide everything, another judge remarked, shaking his head. The whispers felt like tiny daggers. These people used to bow and scrape before him, eager for his approval. Now they turned away as he passed, as if his mere presence might taint them. Inside the courtroom, the ethics panel sat elevated at the bench, 5 distinguished legal professionals who would decide his fate. The irony wasn't lost on Beckett. For once, he was the one looking up at authority. The gallery was packed with spectators, including many faces he recognized. Former defendants he'd sentenced, families he'd torn apart, lawyers whose objections he'd overruled. They all watched him with cold satisfaction as he took his seat at the defendant's table. The panel chairwoman, Justice Maria Rodriguez, called the hearing to order. Her voice carried none of the deference he was accustomed to receiving. This ethics review will examine serious allegations of judicial misconduct against Judge Samuel Beckett, she announced. The evidence presented today will determine whether he is fit to retain his position on the bench. The presentation of evidence began, and with each new revelation, Beckett felt his carefully constructed world crumbling further. They showed statistics from his courtroom. Black defendants receiving sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants for identical crimes. Video clips of him berating black attorneys, dismissing valid objections, showing obvious bias in his rulings. His own emails were projected on a large screen, correspondence with private prison executives discussing ways to keep their facilities filled, messages to wealthy donors who profited from the prison industrial complex promising to keep the pipeline flowing. Then came the testimony about Isaiah Cole's case. Former clerks described how Beckett had manipulated the jury selection, ensuring a predominantly white panel. They revealed how he had secretly coached the prosecution while throwing up roadblocks for the defense. A forensics expert detailed how evidence had been fabricated under Beckett's direction. Phone records proved his coordination with Deputy Warden Mercer to arrange Isaiah's planned execution. Throughout it all, Beckett maintained his stern judicial expression, but his hands trembled beneath the table. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. Then Naomi Ellis rose to deliver her statement. She stood tall, her voice steady and clear as she faced the panel. "I've spent my career fighting for justice in courtrooms like this one," she began. "I've seen good judges and bad judges, but Judge Samuel Beckett represents something far more dangerous. He represents the weaponization of the justice system itself." She turned slightly, making sure both the panel and Beckett could see her face. This man used his position not to serve justice but to perpetuate hatred. He didn't protect society. He protected a system of oppression. Every time he put on those robes, he betrayed the very principles they represent. Beckett's jaw clenched as Naomi continued. The evidence shows a clear pattern of racist behavior spanning decades. But more than that, it shows a man who delighted in wielding power over those he deemed inferior. Judge Beckett is not a man of justice. He is a man of hate. Her words hung in the air as she returned to her seat. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The panel conferred briefly before Justice Rodriguez cleared her throat. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented today, this panel has reached a unanimous decision. She looked directly at Beckett. "Judge Samuel Beckett, you have violated the most sacred principles of judicial conduct. You have demonstrated clear bias, abused your authority, and corrupted the very system you swore to uphold." Beckett's face grew pale as she continued. "Therefore, you are hereby disbarred and stripped of all judicial authority. You will never again serve on any bench in this state or any other jurisdiction." The gallery erupted in cheers and applause. Beckett sat motionless, unable to process what had just happened. His attorney tugged at his sleeve, urging him to stand. As he rose on unsteady legs, the reality began to sink in. Everything he'd built, every ounce of power he'd accumulated over his career, gone in an instant. He stumbled toward the exit, his vision blurring. The courthouse steps outside were crowded with protesters who'd been waiting for this moment. Their angry shouts washed over him as he emerged. "Justice at last, racist judge goes down, no more corrupt courts." For the first time in his life, Samuel Beckett felt truly powerless. No gavel to bang, no bailiff to call for order, no authority to hide behind. He was just a man, a disgraced man, facing the consequences of his actions. The protesters parted slightly, creating a gauntlet he had to walk through. Their signs waved in his face. Their voices rose in unified condemnation. Some held photos of people he'd sentenced unfairly over the years. Without his robes, without his position, without his power, Samuel Beckett looked very small indeed as he made his way down those courthouse steps for the last time. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting warm patches of light across the worn Formica table. Isaiah Cole sat quietly, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the watery brown liquid they'd served in Redwood. The simple pleasure of being able to order what he wanted, sit where he chose, and take his time drinking it still felt surreal. The diner buzzed with the usual morning crowd, truckers grabbing breakfast before their routes, elderly couples sharing pancakes, waitresses calling out orders. Normal people living normal lives. Isaiah watched them, taking in the ordinary scenes he'd missed during his imprisonment. His reflection in the window caught his eye. The orange jumpsuit was gone, replaced by civilian clothes, a clean white shirt, and dark jeans that his mother had bought him. The bruises from his last days in Redwood had faded, but his eyes still carried the intensity forged by years of survival. The bell above the door chimed, and Isaiah looked up to see Naomi Ellis and David Whitmore entering. They spotted him immediately, making their way through the maze of tables. Naomi wore her usual sharp business suit, while Whitmore was dressed casually in khakis and a polo shirt that didn't quite hide his military bearing. "Sorry we're late," Naomi said, sliding into the booth across from Isaiah. "The media won't leave my office alone. Everyone wants an exclusive on your story." Whitmore sat beside her, nodding at Isaiah with the unspoken understanding that existed between SEALs. "How's freedom treating you, brother?" "Still getting used to it," Isaiah replied, his voice carrying the quiet strength that had become his trademark. "Keep expecting to hear a guard's whistle or cell doors closing." The waitress came by, filling coffee cups for Naomi and Whitmore. When she recognized Isaiah from the news, her eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "The state's legal team reached out this morning," Naomi said once the waitress had left. She pulled some documents from her briefcase. "They're terrified of a lawsuit. With everything that's come out about Beckett and Mercer, they know they're vulnerable. They're offering a substantial settlement." Whitmore leaned forward. "We're talking serious money here, Isaiah. Enough to set you up for life after what they put you through." Isaiah studied the papers Naomi had spread on the table. Settlement figures, legal terms, proposals for compensation. The amount they were offering was staggering, more money than he'd ever imagined having. But something didn't sit right. He thought about the men he'd left behind in Redwood. Jamal, who'd risked everything to help him. Others who were serving time on trumped-up charges or facing the same corrupt system that had nearly killed him. "What if we did something different?" Isaiah said slowly, pushing the settlement papers aside. "Instead of taking their money, what if we used this momentum to force real change?" Naomi tilted her head, intrigued. "What kind of change?" "The whole system needs reform," Isaiah continued, his voice growing stronger as he outlined his vision. "Not just Redwood, but every prison where guards abuse their power, every courthouse where judges like Beckett show bias, every place where being black means being presumed guilty." He leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. "We could set up programs to help veterans, especially black veterans, transition after service. Give them support before they end up in the system. Create legal clinics to help people fight wrongful convictions. Build something that actually makes a difference." Whitmore nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Use your case as a catalyst for systemic change." "Exactly," Isaiah said. "The money would help me, but what about everyone else? What about the next Isaiah Cole who gets railroaded by a racist judge? Or the next veteran who struggles to readjust and ends up behind bars?" Naomi was already pulling out her phone, making notes. "We could establish a foundation, use the media attention to raise awareness, partner with civil rights organizations, veterans groups." She looked up at Isaiah, a smile spreading across her face. "You're not just free, Isaiah. You're unstoppable." The energy at the table had shifted. What had started as a discussion about compensation had transformed into something larger, a mission, a purpose that went beyond personal justice. After finalizing some initial plans, Isaiah drove to his mother's house, the same modest home where he'd grown up, where she'd waited and prayed for him every day of his imprisonment. She was waiting on the porch when he pulled up, just as she had when he'd returned from deployment. The sight of her made his throat tight with emotion. She'd aged during his time in prison, worry lines etched deeper in her face, but her eyes still held the same strength that had guided him through his darkest moments. Isaiah climbed the familiar steps and his mother wrapped him in a fierce embrace. He could feel her tears soaking into his shirt as she held him close, her small frame shaking with sobs of relief. "It's over, Mama," he whispered, his own eyes growing wet. "I made it." She pulled back slightly, looking up at her son, her baby boy who'd gone through hell and emerged not broken, but transformed. She shook her head, wiping tears from her cheeks. "No, baby," she said softly. "It's just beginning." Meanwhile, Samuel Beckett sat in the dimly lit motel room, surrounded by peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of mildew. The room's single lamp cast harsh shadows across his haggard face as he stared at the small television mounted on the wall. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted a glass of cheap whiskey to his lips, spilling a few drops onto his once expensive suit. The news anchor's voice filled the cramped space. Former Judge Samuel Beckett has been officially disbarred following a unanimous decision by the State Ethics Board. The investigation revealed decades of racial bias and corruption. Beckett's jaw clenched as his own face appeared on screen, not the commanding presence he'd once been in his courtroom, but a grainy photo of him leaving the ethics hearing, looking defeated and old. His silver hair was unkempt now, his face unshaven, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and too much alcohol. The segment shifted, showing footage of Isaiah Cole speaking at a community center. "This isn't about revenge," Isaiah's steady voice declared. "This is about fixing a broken system that destroys lives." Beckett grabbed the remote, turning up the volume with shaking fingers. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen scrolled endlessly. Disgraced Judge Beckett disbarred. Former SEAL Isaiah Cole becomes advocate for justice reform. Multiple lawsuits filed against corrupt prison officials. He took another drink, larger this time, letting the burning sensation distract him from the humiliation. The motel room was a far cry from his former life. No more luxury condo, no more expensive restaurants, no more respect from his peers. The room's single bed was lumpy, the sheets thin and scratchy. A cockroach scurried across the stained carpet. With trembling hands, Beckett pulled out his phone, the same phone he'd once used to order Isaiah's execution. He scrolled through his contacts, stopping at a name he'd relied on countless times before. Senator William Morrison. They'd played golf together, attended the same fundraisers, shared the same views about keeping certain people in their place. The phone rang 3 times before Morrison answered. "Sam?" The senator's voice was cautious, distant. "Bill," Beckett said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need your help. These lawsuits, they're freezing everything. My accounts, my pension." He swallowed hard. "You know me. You know what I've done for the party." There was a long pause on the other end. When Morrison spoke again, his tone was cold. "What you've done has become a liability, Sam. The evidence they found in your chambers, those emails to Mercer about Cole." Another pause. "You're toxic. No one wants to be near you." "Bill, please," Beckett started, but the line went dead. Rage surged through him. With a roar, he hurled the phone across the room. It hit the wall hard, leaving a dent in the cheap drywall before clattering to the floor. His chest heaved as he tried to control his breathing, but the panic was setting in. Everything was gone. His reputation, destroyed. His savings, frozen by investigators. His friends, if he could call them that, had abandoned him. Even his own daughter had stopped taking his calls after the evidence came out. He slumped back in the chair, his eyes drawn again to the television. Isaiah Cole was still there, standing at a podium surrounded by supporters. He looked strong, confident. Everything Beckett was not. The former SEAL spoke with quiet authority about prison reform, about helping veterans, about changing the system that had nearly killed him. "We're establishing a foundation," Isaiah was saying, "to provide legal aid to those who've been wrongfully convicted. to support veterans who need help transitioning back to civilian life, to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. The camera panned across the crowd, showing faces full of hope and determination. Black, white, Latino, all united behind Isaiah's vision. Former inmates stood alongside lawyers and community leaders. Even some former guards who'd turned whistleblower were there, lending their support to the cause. Beckett watched, unable to look away. This man, whom he'd tried so hard to destroy, was now leading a movement. Isaiah's voice carried weight. People listened when he spoke. He was making real change happen. And here sat Beckett, in a cheap motel room that reeked of failure, watching his own irrelevance play out on a fuzzy television screen. He'd once commanded respect with a mere gesture, had the power to alter lives with the bang of his gavel. Now he couldn't even get his old friends to take his calls. The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, spilling across the carpet. Beckett didn't bother to pick it up. He just sat there, staring at Isaiah's face on the screen, feeling something he'd never experienced before in all his years on the bench. Absolute, complete irrelevance. The world was moving forward without him. His power, his influence, his entire worldview, all of it was being swept away by the very man he'd tried to silence. And there was nothing he could do about it. Isaiah's final words echoed in the small room. The old system is dying, and from its ashes, we'll build something better. Something just. Something true. Beckett reached for the whiskey bottle, but his hands were shaking too badly to pour another glass. On the TV, the crowd erupted in applause as Isaiah stepped away from the podium, his head held high, his purpose clear. Days later, the community center buzzed with energy as young black men filled the rows of chairs, their eyes fixed on Isaiah Cole. The fluorescent lights cast a warm glow across the simple stage where he stood, his presence commanding yet approachable. His military bearing remained evident in his straight posture, but his face held a gentleness that drew people in. "I want to tell you about survival," Isaiah began, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Not just physical survival, but the kind that keeps your soul intact when the whole world tries to crush it." The audience leaned forward, hanging on his every word. Some of them were veterans like him. Others were young men who'd faced their own battles with the justice system. All of them knew what it meant to fight against a system designed to break them. "They put me in Redwood Penitentiary," Isaiah continued, pacing slowly across the stage. "A place where hope goes to die, where men are treated like animals until they become what the system expects them to be." He paused, letting his words sink in. "They tried to break me, they tried to erase me, but I'm still here." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, recognizing their own struggles in his words. "They thought the uniform I wore meant nothing. They thought my service meant nothing. Judge Beckett looked me in the eye and called me a disgrace." Isaiah's voice remained steady, controlled. "But you know what? His words couldn't touch me. His hatred couldn't define me." Outside the community center, Samuel Beckett stood in the shadows, his worn coat pulled tight against the evening chill. Through the large windows, he watched the man he'd tried to destroy speak with power and purpose. Beckett's once imposing frame had shrunk, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his fallen status. His expensive suits had been replaced by off-the-rack clothes that hung loosely on his frame. Inside, Isaiah continued his speech, but his sharp eyes had caught movement through the window. He recognized Beckett's silhouette immediately, but didn't break stride in his presentation. "They put me in solitary, thinking darkness would break my spirit," Isaiah told the crowd. "But in that darkness, I found my strength. In that silence, I found my voice." Beckett shifted uncomfortably outside, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets. The streetlights cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the new lines of defeat etched there. He watched as the young men inside nodded and called out in support of Isaiah's words. "When they scheduled my execution," Isaiah's voice carried through the glass, "they thought they'd won. But they didn't understand something fundamental about the human spirit, about our spirit. We don't break, we transform." Beckett turned away, unable to bear more. His shoes scraped against the concrete as he began to walk away from the building, from the living testimony of his greatest failure. The door to the community center opened. Isaiah's footsteps echoed in the quiet street as he walked out, leaving his rapt audience waiting inside. He moved with purpose toward Beckett's retreating figure. Beckett heard the footsteps and stopped. His shoulders tensed, but he couldn't bring himself to turn around. The street was empty except for the two of them, the man who'd wielded power like a weapon and the man who'd refused to be broken by it. Isaiah stopped a few feet behind Beckett. The former judge's head was bowed, his once proud stance now crumpled with shame. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Isaiah spoke, his voice clear and measured in the quiet street. "I don't hate you." Beckett's head lifted slightly, but he still couldn't turn to face Isaiah. "But I won't waste my time on you either," Isaiah continued. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just simple truth. For the first time in his life, Samuel Beckett, the man who'd commanded courtrooms with his rhetoric, who'd sentenced men to death with eloquent speeches about justice, found himself completely wordless. His mouth opened, then closed again, no sound emerging. Isaiah didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked back toward the community center, his steps purposeful and sure. Through the windows, the warm light spilled out onto the sidewalk, and the faces of young men eager to hear more of his story were visible. Beckett remained rooted to the spot, watching as Isaiah returned to the podium. The former SEAL stood tall, his presence filling the room with strength and hope. The young men gathered around him, their faces bright with possibility and purpose. From his position on the dark street, Beckett could see the future unfolding inside that room, a future he'd tried to prevent but had inadvertently helped create. Isaiah's voice carried faintly through the glass, continuing his message of transformation and resilience. The former judge took a step backward, then another, his figure blending into the shadows of the street. Inside, Isaiah continued speaking, surrounded by the light and energy of possibility, while outside, Beckett faded into the darkness, forgotten, irrelevant, a relic of a system that was finally changing. Isaiah's voice grew stronger, more passionate, as he shared his vision for the future. The young men around him nodded and called out in agreement, their energy building with each word. They were no longer just an audience, they were becoming part of something larger, something transformative. Through the window, Beckett took one last look at the scene, at Isaiah standing tall and proud, at the hope-filled faces surrounding him, at the future taking shape in that simple community center room. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the night, leaving behind the man he'd failed to destroy, who had instead become something greater than either of them had imagined. If you enjoyed the story of Isaiah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. Instead becomes something greater than either of them had imagined. If you enjoyed the story of Isaiah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.